So there's a lot of deep-seated stuff that maybe relates to childhood, like Tim said, that really drive a lot of these events because people are trying to recreate what cannot be recreated.
And the more and more I do this job, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, it's accurate. It's just true. And in the way that people make decisions is not typically driven by money. Again, like Dan just mentioned, it's not money that's driving it. It's an underlying desire. It's an underlying feeling that's really driving this behavior. And it's really goes back to values, fulfillment. And what I think is extremely tragic when it comes to all of these emotions is it distorts the value of the dollar in the sense that people don't understand what it's actually worth. Because what they're doing is they're judging the value of the dollar, what everybody else is judging it based off of. But they're not looking inside and saying, what do I think the value of that dollar is? Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your host, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my colleague, Dan Weiss. Before we get started into our topic today, I just want to give a little bit of an announcement like I always do, which is if you really like our content, please subscribe, like, and share it. We really would appreciate it. We're just trying to help out, educate people on the art of finance. So for today's podcast, I'm actually going to read off the title of this one. I think it's a really good way to start. And we have titled this podcast, Self-Fulfilling and Imposed Financial Tragedies. And it's a mouthful, but it's a really good title for what we want to talk about today. But to get us started, Dan, what do you mean? Like, what is or what are self-imposed fulfilling tragedies versus, for example, an inherent tragedy? What do you mean? Well, you made the title. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm happy to explain. And I don't know if you can look these up in any kind of dictionary. This is mine and Tim's own verbiage from our years of experience in dealing with qualitative finance. I guess, first of all, Nathaniel probably didn't join us too because he knew that we were going to jump on some of our soapboxes and probably be long-winded on this, and maybe he wanted nothing to do with that. But we like this topic, I think, really embodies a lot of what our podcast is about. Behavioral, qualitative finance, and it's really personal to me because a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about, like my passion, my interest in this kind of work really leads from my own financial tragedies, of which case I would define those as imposed tragedies. And so the last north of 25 plus years that I've been really formally and informally studying finance comes out of experiences 25 years ago for me. Experiences that I think everybody gets to experience in some way or another. So to answer Tim's question, when we're talking about self-fulfilling or imposed financial tragedies, these are tragedies that we don't really hear people talk about very often. Usually when people are talking about stuff, it's inherent tragedies. So the first category here, these are tragic environments related to finance that oneself or somebody around you creates. It didn't have to be. And it's tragic because it didn't have to be. An inherent tragedy would be something that impacts your finances that you don't have any control over. So, financial mishaps or inabilities or barriers that might be due to creed, race, religion, where someone might be born, different socio-economic issues, illiteracy or educational systems that may or may not be available. Like those are awful tragedies because of its impact on people and awful because it can be discriminatory in nature, and people don't have a choice when it comes to those things. So we're not really talking about those. Those are horrible events that we do talk about quite a bit. We want to talk about things that you might actually be able to do something about and prevent. So those are the self-fulfilling and imposed tragedies.
And I think it's a very dynamic conversation, which I'm excited to jump into, because I think it really comes down to the qualitative or the behavioral side of being a human. I think is sometimes was what that imposition or an imposing nature is. And in order to understand that, you have to be aware of it, which sometimes is very difficult. I'm not going to sugarcoat that and say it's easy to just go ahead and do, but it's important to be that awareness is important. So to kind of jump into the next topic, Dan, I'm just curious, like kind of what we see that's not inherent. I know you kind of mentioned, you kind of laid the framework of the inherent tragedies, but like what is not inherent? So it's what I'm kind of curious about, and why is it a topic that honestly we should be talking about?
Yeah, there's a lot, and Tim and I discussed a number of these that we just common day see that we would just kind of want to highlight, because sometimes this is where you kind of get stuck in it. They don't appear like tragedies. And by the way, what someone might experience as a negative or a tragic environment is not the case for everybody. You can have the same thing, and for some people it's a good fit for, and some things it's not. And that's kind of the trap, if you will, or the stumble, if you will. So we can go through a few of these and kind of show what this looks like. A lot of it comes down to awareness. So Tim and I will talk a lot about financial awareness and the lack of it really being there. So here's one that we see quite a bit. A lot of these tragedies you're going to see, it's not, again, we're not talking about lower income or impoverished people. There's really in a lot of cases just not the ability to even experience these tragedies, because you don't have the situation to even get yourself in to be in there. You're dealing with a lot more inherent tragedies. So here's one that we see all the time. Buying a second home can be a very tragic environment. Here's why.
Say why, Dan. Let's talk about why.
It's very much a status symbol. And so when people start making money and they start having assets, it often comes up in a lot of our discussions. I want to buy a vacation home. Get that? And what ends up happening at times is a tragedy gets created. Here's why this happens. So if indeed you go and buy a vacation home and it's something that that you really, really are going to utilize, it's you, then that's not a tragedy. That's a life improvement, a quality improvement. But what we see a lot of times is somebody will buy a second home, maybe because they feel like they're supposed to, because that's what happens when you start making money, or maybe it's because they see other people do it and it must be great. I've got a friend who bought an expensive home 5 hours north of here, off of a lake area that they've been in for decades, but didn't own a home there. Like, that's not a tragedy. That fits what they want to do. But here's the tragic part for perhaps someone else that might make the same move, but not aware of what's important to themselves. You buy the home and you basically become entrapped. So, and I experienced a little bit of this when I was younger to an extent. Once you have that second home, especially if it's hours away, you now often we see people then have an obligation or a feeling of an obligation to spend every single weekend at that home. And so the tragedy lies that in a sense, the house becomes
a weight.
A weight, an entrapment that basically becomes a chore that you have to spend X amount of hours every time to go up there, or in this area, winterize that property, perhaps if it's, in the upper Midwest, and you lose some of that fulfillment, some of that enjoyment. It also takes you out of the community that perhaps you live in. So if you're like me and have a young child, and then have to go to a cabin up north, I'm also losing the opportunity of spending time with friends and developing that part of my life and understanding my hometown community, because I feel this pull to get the value out of going somewhere else every single weekend. So what might seem like a great status symbol or a really nice feather to put in your cap ends up becoming actually more of a chore. That's a tragedy.
Well, Dan, what if somebody came to you and said, well, Dan, I can rent it. I can rent it and have the pleasure, right? Like that's always the thought process of, hey, but what if I can make income off of it and I can have a rental? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, Funny, because actually that is a whole nother tragedy itself that we actually often talk about. That could make sense. It could, but now you've become a landlord. And so again, this is an awareness activity of does this make sense or not? We have a lot of people that will talk about once they start getting some cash flow, I want to buy rental real estate, right? For example, and that they have seen other people build tremendous wealth doing so. By the way, that's often done more than not over a elongated period of time, like any other kind of investment. But the issue there, and we get into a conversation about this quite a bit, is unless you're willing to have a handful of properties, a portfolio of real estate properties that you want to build up, this can become a real downer for people. I mean, I experienced this. I had a rental property on the other side of town for years. And even when I had great tenants, and I did have great tenants, it's still there. It's still a weight, like Tim described before. It's still, I have to deal with anything that shows up here. So it could be a situation where you can't get away and go on a vacation elsewhere because you have to deal with the rental issues that kind of come up to play. It can damper people's retirement. And when we have one or two properties, whether it's in a situation like Tim said, or a different kind of rental property, the cash flow seems fine, but it's never really passive. There's always taxes, there's always repairs, there's always people don't pay you in time, and you got to chase them down. But it's never enough cash flow in those situations where it replaces income for you not to be able to say, I don't want to do X, Y, and Z. In order to do that, that's where you have to have multiple properties to either warrant paying someone to actually manage the property, or B, have enough cash flow for it to make a difference. So again, it's one of those things where it sounds great, but sometimes it becomes tragic because it's more work than what it's perhaps worth.
Yeah. And I think too, like to add on to the vacation home is it seems to be that when people are talking about vacation homes, it's because they experienced it as a kid. So for me, give an example myself, I grew up in Utah. If people don't know that, listen to my interview. But in Utah, there's a lake that splits Idaho and the border of Utah, and it's called Bear Lake. And that's where I would go in the summers. I'd go up there with my family, and it was a ton of fun as a kid. I mean, I'd go with my cousins, and we'd go up and play, and we'd hang out, and my brother and I would catch carp on the beach. And like, it was just a grand old time. My great grandma is still there to this day. And my two uncles have properties up there. I mean, it's just a beautiful place. But getting older, it's just very different. What I'm starting to realize is congrats to all parents, because vacations are a chore because you have to hike me as a little kid up there, pay attention, get the food, do everything, right? It takes a lot of time. But sometimes, and the reason why I bring that up is not to say, oh, don't do it or it's too much work, but it's more so that you're trying to recreate something maybe of your childhood. And the reason why I bring that up is that's very emotional. It creates a lot of potential value for you. That is a lot of pull. There's a lot of drive for me. I had a lot of fun. I want my kids to experience that. I want my other family to have my cousins around and like have them meet their cousins, right? There's way more to it than just, hey, should I buy this rental property, this real estate rental property up on a lake on a house? Maybe that's in Wisconsin now because that's where I live, but it's extremely emotional. And what sometimes is hard is to take a step back and ask, why am I desiring this? What am I really trying to fulfill? What is this really going to do? Is this the right move for my family? What if you have kids that are in, for example, baseball, that are traveling every weekend, soccer in the summers, every weekend? Is it going to be that easy to just jump up and go to the lake house? And then the ideology is like, well, at some point, when this happens, we'll make the move. And all of a sudden it's not. So that awareness or reflection of being like, what is the reality of the scenario? What are we really trying to fulfill? And can maybe we fulfill it in different ways? Maybe this isn't the only answer. Maybe another answer is once a year, we do an Airbnb with the family, get everybody to chip in, and we all go at once. right? That everyone can plan for that specific time. So it's more of all of a sudden now there's opportunities or opportunity costs or different planning scenarios that we can start looking at to fulfill that one desire that may be, hey, I just want my kids to experience this wonderful thing that I experienced when I grew up. And that is not anything about money. The money is the effect. It's like it's the outcome. It's not what's driving it though. It's that you have to use it to potentially fulfill said desire. And you can maybe fulfill it in a lot of different ways.
Very well said.
Yeah.
I mean, related, and I think a good segue to this too is that a lot of some of these events we're talking about, these tragic events, they come out of trying to satisfy a specific feeling. So we see this all the time. And by the way, like, please, we know like what we're talking about here is a lot of sensitive stuff. We're not trying to insult or offend anybody. We all are subject to this. I mean, half of this list that I'm looking at for us to kind of talk about, I mean, I've been at some point in my life subjected to or bought into. Yeah. It just happens, and it's very, very commonplace, which is why we thought we should talk about it. So there's a lot of deep-seated stuff that maybe relates to childhood, like Tim said, that really drive a lot of these events because people are trying to recreate what cannot be recreated. They're doing something, they're being driven because it's a self-image thing. Sometimes that's necessary. We definitely have clients, right, that have to drive a specific car because they kind of have to play that part. That's what it is, right? And then we have people that also drive a specific car because they want someone to think differently of them. But usually that's not the case. When someone sees that car, they don't think of that person. They think about just wanting to own that car, not who's actually in it. But that still is a big driver in a lot of cases that we see for people purchasing things. It's not right or wrong. It's about awareness. Sometimes, ego can get involved without question. We see a lot of behaviors in finance that are really driven by shame, by guilt, and by belonging. I mean, those are really very powerful things that are, I don't want to say necessarily sad drivers. I mean, I have a really close friend who, for example, needs to earn more money because it makes him feel better about being picked on when he was younger and people saying he wouldn't amount to anything. He doesn't actually spend most of that money and doesn't really care to even share how much money he has with anybody. But it's a soothing mechanism for himself, but it's driving him. Is that tragic in his case? I don't know. It definitely settles a need for him, and he seems to have a really good understanding of that. I have another friend, for example, where it's a very similar, I think, experience, but the outlay of it looks really, really different. The question, I think, between, say, those two personalities is the one is aware, I think, and understands why they're doing X, Y, and Z, where the other is not. Now, that I do think is tragic.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting in this topic too, and this is where I go back to my econ classes, when all of a sudden you start looking at like economics and the theory of economics and trying to identify and tease out this stuff, right? And tease out why we make decisions and what's the most optimal route, what's the equilibrium. And I always just never understood it, because the first thing that they always say in your microeconomics classes, rule number one of economics, there is assumptions, and there is no such thing as free lunch, right? And we're going to assume about a lot of things, right? Assumptions is what economics is built off of. And the assumption that's being made is that everybody acts rationally. You're a rational consumer. I'm going to understand exactly what I'm doing, and I'm going to pay X amount for my Snickers bar because I know exactly what that utility is going to be of that Snickers bar in that moment, every single time, repetitively over and over and over again. I looked at it, I was like, I am not that person. I'm not that person. And I know I'm irrational and I have emotions and I don't act in that in any way. So how are these models representing actual behavior on the micro scale? I get it. Large population numbers, statistics, sure, you can start doing it. So it kind of geared me towards the behavioral finance realm. And that's where I started getting really interested. Like, okay, you're starting to speak my language. People actually have emotions. People are not robots. People have feelings, and they make different decisions. And what's really interesting is the more and more I read about that specific literature or other literature from psychology or from, just different walks of life within that realm of understanding the human brain, the elements, the emotions, the feelings. And the more and more I do this job, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, it's accurate. It's just true. And in the way that people make decisions is not typically driven by money. Again, like Dan just mentioned, it's not money that's driving it. It's an underlying desire. It's an underlying feeling that's really driving this behavior. And it's really goes back to values, fulfillment. And what I think is extremely tragic when it comes to all of these emotions is it distorts the value of the dollar in the sense that people don't understand what it's actually worth. Because what they're doing is they're judging the value of the dollar, what everybody else is judging it based off of. But they're not looking inside and saying, what do I think the value of that dollar is? What do I want to vote my values towards? Because it's very, very difficult. Social media makes it hard. Growing up in certain environments, it makes it very difficult. Even looking at getting a job. There's a lot of people that only want to become a lawyer because they want the JD behind their name. And that's it, to feel accomplished. But then they're not accomplished and they keep pushing. I mean, the same thing happens on the scale of money. And that money is making those driving decisions. So if we really want to start looking at self-image, fulfillment, being belonging, like those are driving factors into decisions financially. And it can be very tragic because it could actually be, and why Dan says it's tragic isn't because they make a bad financial decision. It's tragic because it's not what they actually want, because they're not taking a step back and really looking at like, what am I really trying to do here? Because if you can really sit down and think about that, all of a sudden you start changing the dial back to being like, hey, the value of the dollar for me, it means a very different thing than what Dan thinks it means. And I think I'm okay with that. And I think I'm just going to go in my own lane. And I'm just going to sit there and I feel good about it. And I'm okay with it. And guess what? That may mean that you spend more money than Dan. It may mean that you spend less money than Dan. It may mean that you buy the nice car that Dan doesn't have. And it may mean that you buy the beat up car that Dan doesn't have. And at the end of the day, that means that you've optimized your dollar because you are doing what you think it deserves instead of trying to relate it to everybody else. And that's why Dan talks about ego, self-image, belonging. Like these are things that we don't bring it up because it's just like snap your fingers and you're like, oh, I get it. It's like, no, that takes a lot of self-reflecting. To really understand it. But we're never taught that in school to sit back and be like, well, where should you spend your dollar? What does that really mean? How should you really think about it? And it's funny too, Dan, that everybody in politics, right, is you vote with your dollar. You can vote with your dollar, but people talk about it in the sense of like environmental, right? Or making change, but they never talk about making a change for you personally and what it does for you, right? It's always external. It's never internal. But if you can go internal, it can then be actually very positive on the external side.
I think we hear a lot of talk actually, Tim, right, of the opposite. I mean, Tim and I know many people where, for example, they were doing fine, they were doing well, but still stretched above their means, for example, to get into a particular subdivision or club in a sense, because they're seeking that sense of acceptance and belonging. And even though perhaps what they're doing in the eyes of most other people is far more than what they have, it's just an extra push to get that because they either value or really don't value, but think they should value being inside that community, that they're willing to push themselves that extra mile and the stresses that come with it. And a lot of that can be cultural. We've seen that within specific cultures, that is what you should do. Therefore, go ahead and do it, regardless of what the consequences are.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
a tough one.
It's a tough one. One thing that Tim and I talk a lot about too, that we see, can create some of these events too, regardless of where someone's wealth is. When we always talk about, I know we've used this analogy before, we talk about planning and positioning, we always frame it from this concept of a champagne pyramid at a wedding, right? We always joke when people would go to weddings, which is coming back a little bit now. But nonetheless, what we'll see people do, and this is even more common when we see young wealth, and which is something we should talk about too, because that plays into a lot of this between immigrants to wealth and natives to wealth. And Tim talks a lot about that. But you see this pouring of the champagne and all these different levels of these glasses, never really filling a single cup. And what that really does is it creates an imbalance. Instead of perhaps filling the top cup and letting that get done well in cascade to creating that balance and filling this up. So I'll throw this to Tim to talk a little bit about with that concept in mind, but the tragedy of spreading yourself too thin on asset diversification, or spreading yourself too thin in the misusage of leverage. From a planning standpoint, something we talk about all the time.
Yeah. And Dan, we do use the analogy of the champagne glasses quite a bit. And you could reframe it too in sense of saying, like, you got to lay a good foundation, right? You don't want to build, and Dan has been saying this for years since we've started the business, but you don't want to build a house of cards where your underlying foundation is very flimsy. One card you pull, the whole house of cards comes down. And that's what can happen if you don't build it appropriately and you don't fill up the appropriate glasses or set the appropriate foundation at the beginning. Because what will happen is people start looking and try to jump into pockets that maybe they're just not ready for yet. It's kind of like a baby. You don't have a baby all of a sudden come out of the womb and start running around. Well, first they have to make sure they can hold their head up. Then after they hold their head up, they want to make sure they do tummy time and they can roll over. And after they start doing that, they start to crawl. And after they start to crawl, they start walking around the furniture. And after they stop holding onto the furniture, they kind of just stand there and fall back. And all of a sudden they start doing a couple steps. And then next thing you know, they're running around. There's no difference with financial stability. Is you need to create a nice foundation in order to do that. But you got to focus on one thing at a time. If the baby starts to just put its head up and start running, it's going to look really funky. It's not going to make any sense. You're like, whoa, stop. Like, let's just figure out how to hold your head up straight. But what's really, really hard though, is that I think and this goes back to when people aren't aware of where they're at, and they're not aware of what they should be doing or where they should be putting assets. And it fundamentally comes back down into thinking about where you're at. And it's a financial awareness. And I read a really, really good research article that one of the UW professors had written with a few other colleagues across the nation about financial vulnerability and what that means. And what they said is, like, look, financial vulnerability, and this really plays into this idea that, like, the spread of diversification, is financial vulnerability comes down to a few things. You can split it up into two categories. One is objective financial vulnerability, which means you just don't have the assets. Right? You may be in a situation that you cannot afford your bills. That's objective. That's just straightforward financial vulnerability. But then there's this idea of subjective financial vulnerability, which I love how the way they presented it, because we talk about this all the time. The subjective is where they boiled it down to is financial awareness and financial literacy. And what we really hit on right now is this financial awareness, because even somebody that has a lot of money, right, objectively is not financially vulnerable, can be financially vulnerable because they're objectively or subjectively not aware of their current situation, which is what Dan's talking about, is being spread too thin, where I'm like, I want to invest in PE. I want to invest in Bitcoin. I want to invest in Tesla. I want to invest in all these places. I also want to invest for my kids' education. And I also want a non-qualified account for this new second home that we just talked about. And all of a sudden the cash flows get spread so thin that no goals are really being met. But it actually is creating financial vulnerability because we're not really focusing and we're spread too thin. It's very similar to time. When people's time gets spread too thin, they're not as effective. They can't function as well. If you listen to anybody that has been successful, they say they take time to think. And what it is, because they can process through that information. The same idea financially is, if you're spread too thin, too many hands in a pot, there's no way to plan, strategize, and get things actually moving. And it creates a lot of potential vulnerability, not just for people who don't have money, but for people who have a lot of money but aren't aware of their situation. And maybe do lack some financial literacy in the sense that they don't understand the investment they're making. They don't understand how to utilize leverage appropriately. And then they're misusing and not optimizing their assets in a way that can be actually very beneficial. And it's funny, and if you see people where you would probably, anybody who's listening would determine that they have been successful in their finances, A lot of it is very focused and concentrated over multiple years. That's just a fact. I mean, I could even take Warren Buffett. You could take Bill Gates. You could take even Elon Musk. They're very focused individuals and very good at certain things. LeBron James. I mean, I could go on a litany of a list, even like famous writers, Maya Angelou. I mean, you could go on and on about people who are successful, find a way that they really maximize what they're good at. So I'm not saying like, hey, you have to be good at like your finances, but it's like the idea is that we can't be spread too thin. It becomes inefficient. You start having waste, right? That's even, you're talking now even like physics and chemistry. Like you don't want waste. You want to limit waste. You want to maximize energy and potential. And that's what happens when people spread out those glasses too much. And it becomes very tragic because as Dan said, it's tragic because it doesn't need to be that way. It doesn't have to be like that, but sometimes people fall into it. And a lot of it is driven back to what we just talked about, because their friends are doing it, their family's doing it, because they had a mentor that did it. And what scares me to death is the ability that like you don't see under the iceberg. There's a reason why the greatest ship of all time sank, because it hit the iceberg and the iceberg was bigger under the ice. Like that, you just don't know what's under there and why they're doing it and what they have to back them. And you can't make decisions unless they're completely honestly open to you about how they made it work.
Great. Those are great thoughts, Tim. I mean, we see it together all the time. And I think that kind of covers a couple others too that we see too. I mean, there is a vulnerability factor that Tim just referred to, an instability that we often see because people are.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time,